Work hard, get ahead. It's the central promise of the modern economy, that your paycheck is a direct reflection of your performance and productivity. This chart shows how that promise once functioned. In the mid-20th century, U.S. labor productivity and hourly compensation rose in almost perfect lockstep, supporting the idea that a competitive market pays workers exactly the value they generate. But in the late 1970s, the lines diverged. As American labor productivity surged by roughly 70% over the next 40 years, the mechanism translating those gains into wages simply stopped working. While output climbed toward that 70% mark, average worker compensation grew by less than 15%. The vast majority of the value workers created never made it into their bank accounts. Sociologist Jake Rosenfeld argues this gap proves that the labor market is not a neutral, objective pricing machine. It is a social construct, heavily influenced by factors that have nothing to do with how hard you work. If your pay is no longer tied to the value you generate, the numbers on your paycheck are dictated by something else entirely: structural leverage. Classical economists like Jan Tinbergen have long dismissed wage stagnation as a race between education and technology. The argument is simple: if your pay is flat, it is because your skills have not kept pace with technological demands. This chart illustrates the counter theory, monopsony. In the real world, labor markets are full of friction. Moving is expensive, and in many regions, a single employer dominates the landscape. This gives companies the power to price labor well below its actual revenue product. Even when companies attempt to pay for performance, the metrics often backfire. Tying compensation to narrow, quantifiable data points frequently encourages workers to optimize for the metric while destroying the actual value of the work. Take the case of Meta. When executive bonuses were tied strictly to user growth, the focus shifted entirely to the numbers. The cost was a systemic failure to protect user privacy and platform security, variables that were harder to count but more important to long-term stability. Similarly, when the frozen vegetable brand Green Giant rewarded employees for finding insects in the produce, workers began bringing bugs from home. They were not improving food quality. They were simply manufacturing the performance data required for a bonus. True value is rarely measurable in real time, and what is measurable is easily manipulated. Because performance is such a fragile metric, employers rely on hidden sociological mechanisms to set your pay. Rosenfeld identifies 4 hidden variables that actually set your wage. The most dominant is power, the ability of workers to extract a share of revenue even when the employer resists. This photograph captures the mid-century era of balanced labor relations. At that time, labor unions acted as a reliable counterweight to corporate leverage, securing a wage premium of 10% or more for their members. The collapse of that power is visible in the trucking industry following the 1980 Motor Carrier Act. Deregulation fragmented the industry, allowing firms to bypass unions and effectively dismantle collective bargaining. For truckers, the result was a 33% drop in median wages in major hubs. Today, many port drivers are classified as independent contractors, meaning they bear all the costs of idle time and maintenance while holding zero bargaining power. In the gig economy, power is hidden behind algorithmic management. When pay formulas are adjusted instantly by a server, the human counterparty is removed from the negotiation entirely. You cannot bargain with code. The second variable is inertia. Economist Truman Bewley found that wages possess an inherent downward rigidity. When revenue drops, companies prefer layoffs over pay cuts, because cutting salaries violates a psychological contract, destroying the morale of those who stay. It is easier for a firm to let people go than to lower the price of every hour worked. Recruiters rarely recalculate the value of a role from scratch. They default to what the position already pays to avoid friction. This means your starting offer is often a legacy of decisions made years before you were even hired. The third hidden variable is simply mimicry. Much of what we call the market rate is just corporations copying their competitors to avoid being outliers in their industry. In the fast food industry, firms often default to the legal minimum wage as a standard starting point. They are not calculating the individual utility of a worker. They are mimicking a standardized low-wage industry norm. The final variable is equity. the psychological bounds of fairness within an organization. Employers maintain an information advantage through pay secrecy. When 50% of U.S. workers are discouraged from discussing pay, they lose the ability to negotiate for a fair share of the revenue. A violation of internal equity can be fatal to a career. In the early 2000s, American Airlines CEO Donald Carty successfully asked workers to take pay cuts while secretly ensuring his own executive team received massive bonuses. Once the secret broke, the workforce revolt was so intense that it forced Carty's resignation. Even with the legal right to set pay, he could not survive the collapse of his organization's equity norms. Sociologist Paula England argues that equity norms also drive the systemic underpayment of nurses and teachers. Despite the high technical skill required for care work, cultural biases regarding women's roles often act as a wage ceiling, regardless of high economic demand. Compensation is ultimately policed by social boundaries. Employers pay the minimum that corporate mimicry suggests and that employee outrage will permit. The catalyst that turned these four factors against workers was the rise of shareholder primacy in the 1970s. By aligning executive pay with stock prices, agency theory shifted the entire C-suite's focus toward short-term cost reduction and labor extraction. Private equity firms like Bain Capital utilized this leverage to extreme effect. They acquired companies, laid off hundreds of workers, and then used the threat of offshoring to force those same workers to return at significantly lower wages. This chart compares a McDonald's franchise in the US to one in Denmark. Danish workers earn double their American counterparts, with full benefits, operating under the same brand and the same global equipment. Danish operators maintain these pay scales while keeping menu prices competitive with American outlets. This shows that the capital for higher wages is available. It is simply a matter of institutional norms and bargaining power. These dynamics align with Karl Marx's theory of surplus value. In an environment without labor power, capital extracts the difference between the value a worker produces and the absolute minimum they will accept to survive. Meanwhile, Max Weber's theory of social closure explains the top of the market. Elites use credentials and professional mimicry to build walls around high-paying roles, ensuring those opportunities remain exclusive. Economist Thomas Piketty notes that the explosion of executive pay is driven by a collapse of restrictive social norms, not a sudden surge in executive productivity. This governance model acts as a reliable mechanism for the upward transfer of capital. The COVID-19 pandemic forced a recognition of the essential worker, those in logistics and retail who kept society functioning during a global crisis. Despite their immense social value, most of these workers saw little change in their long-term compensation. Pay does not reflect how essential you are to society. It reflects how much leverage you hold at the negotiating table. We are currently seeing wages rise at the bottom of the economy, largely due to demographic labor shortages following the pandemic. But because this growth is driven by a temporary shortage rather than permanent collective bargaining, it remains fragile. Without a change in power dynamics, these gains will likely disappear during the next recession. Realizing a more equitable economy requires moving past the myth of a frictionless, meritocratic labor market. Wages are a negotiated settlement. True economic reform does not start with upskilling the individual. It starts with rewriting the structural balance of power.